Every time a Targaryen is born, the gods toss a coin, and the world holds its breath. It's one of the most famous lines in all of Westeros. But here's the question almost nobody asks. Was it actually true? Were the Targaryens really cursed? Did madness run through their blood like dragonfire? Or has history simply remembered the worst among them while forgetting everyone else? When most people think of House Targaryen, they think of the Mad King, Aerys II, screaming, "Burn them all," as his kingdom collapsed around him. Or they think of Daenerys, the woman who broke chains and then burned an entire city. To many, that seems like proof enough. Targaryens are destined to go mad. Case closed. But if you look closer through nearly 300 years of Targaryen rule, the truth is far more terrifying. The greatest enemy of House Targaryen wasn't the Starks, the Lannisters, or the White Walkers. It was themselves, and that enemy grew stronger with every generation. Before we can understand why so many Targaryens lost their minds, we have to understand who they really were. Long before they ruled Westeros, the Targaryens lived in Old Valyria, a civilization so advanced that its people bent dragons to their will. While the rest of the world fought with steel, the Valyrians conquered continents with fire. To everyone else, they weren't just kings, they were almost gods. The Targaryens weren't even the most powerful dragon lord family back then. There were dozens of greater houses. Yet, unlike every one of those families, the Targaryens survived because of one young girl named Daenerys, known forever as Daenerys the Dreamer. She saw a vision of Old Valyria consumed by fire, mountains exploding, and an empire ending in a single day. Her father believed her, though most people laughed. They abandoned the richest civilization on Earth based on a dream. 12 years later, the Doom of Valyria destroyed almost every Dragonlord family in existence. The Targaryens survived because they listened to what everyone else dismissed as madness. From that moment onward, dreams, prophecies, and visions became deeply woven into the identity of House Targaryen. Some dreams saved them, others destroyed them. After generations, it became almost impossible to tell the difference. Was someone truly receiving prophetic visions, or were they simply losing their grip on reality? Even the Targaryens couldn't always tell. If your family history tells you dreams predict the future, then every nightmare suddenly feels important. Every strange feeling becomes a sign, and every coincidence becomes destiny. Imagine living your entire life believing the next vision might save the world or destroy it. That is enough pressure to break almost anyone. Yet the dreams were only the beginning. The Targaryens also chose to marry each other, brother to sister, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, again and again. To outsiders, it was disgusting. To the Targaryens, it was necessary to keep the Dragonlord blood pure so they wouldn't lose their connection to dragons. At first, it seemed to work. Dragons continued to hatch, and the dynasty grew stronger. But blood has a memory. Every generation increased the chances that hidden weaknesses would become impossible to ignore. While George R.R. Martin never reduces Targaryen madness to genetics alone, repeated close family marriages almost certainly increase the risk of inherited mental and physical problems. But genetics alone doesn't explain the madness, because plenty of Targaryens shared the exact same blood and never descended into insanity. There was something more. Absolute power. Imagine growing up hearing that you are closer to gods than men. Your ancestors rode dragons, and the Iron Throne belongs to you by blood. If that's all you've ever known, how do you react when someone tells you no? For a Targaryen, losing power felt unnatural, as though the universe itself had made a mistake. That belief created rulers who couldn't accept disagreement or failure. Once someone like that becomes paranoid, things get dangerous quickly. Every criticism becomes treason, every rival becomes a traitor, and eventually, everyone looks like an enemy. Absolute power slowly isolated them from anyone willing to tell them the truth. The lonely road to madness rarely begins with insanity. It begins with isolation. Even when they ruled millions, they remained emotionally alone, separate from the great houses, and sometimes even from each other. Isolation doesn't just create loneliness. Sometimes it creates monsters. Who was the first Targaryen to truly show the world what madness looked like? Most people would answer the Mad King, but Westeros had already seen glimpses of Targaryen madness nearly 2 centuries earlier in King Maegor. Maegor wasn't born with a reputation for cruelty. As a young prince, he was an extraordinary warrior, enormous, fearless, and wielding the legendary sword Blackfire while riding Balerion the Black Dread. He looked like the perfect Targaryen prince. But strength and wisdom are two very different things. When Maegor finally wore the crown, the faith militant rose against him, and several great lords challenged his authority. While many kings would have tried diplomacy, Maegor had a different solution. Kill anyone who stood in his way. Refuse to kneel, burn the castle. Question his legitimacy, take their head. Fear became his favorite weapon. At first, people obeyed, but fear can never buy loyalty. People stopped speaking honestly around him, and his court fell silent. No one dared disagree, and that's when paranoia began to feed itself. One of the darkest examples came after the construction of the Red Keep. Maegor wanted its secret passages known only to him. After the castle was completed, he rewarded every builder with a magnificent feast, then ordered every single one of them killed simply because they knew too much. That wasn't military strategy, that was fear transformed into brutality, resulting in a kingdom ruled by terror. Yet madness didn't always look violent. Sometimes it looked holy. Enter King Baelor. If Maegor ruled through fear, Baelor ruled through faith. On the surface, he was gentle, peaceful, and kind. But eventually, his devotion crossed a line into obsession. Baelor became convinced that nearly every earthly pleasure was sinful. He fasted constantly, locked away his own sisters to preserve their purity, and refused practical advice from experienced lords because he believed divine guidance was enough. Excessive righteousness can be just as dangerous as tyranny. A ruler who believes every decision comes directly from the gods leaves no room for disagreement. If heaven supports you, anyone who opposes you must be wrong. Baelor eventually weakened his body to the breaking point through endless fasting, leaving historians to wonder whether religious devotion alone explained his actions or whether something deeper was happening inside his mind. A pattern was emerging, one king consumed by violence, another consumed by faith. Different personalities, yet both drifted away from reality. But if madness were an inevitable curse, how do you explain the kings who ruled wisely for decades? Take Aerys the Conciliator, who inherited a fractured kingdom and chose to listen, negotiate, build roads, and improve laws. His reign lasted over half a century and became one of the greatest periods of peace Westeros had ever known. Or consider Daenerys II, the Good, who united kingdoms through diplomacy instead of conquest. Even Viserys I wasn't remembered as a mad king. His greatest flaw wasn't insanity, but rather believing everyone else wanted peace as much as he did. If these kings remained perfectly sane, why did others fall apart? The answer may lie in trauma. Every generation of Targaryens carried impossible burdens: civil wars, assassinations, stillbirths, dragon battles, and family betrayals. Imagine watching your brothers kill each other or seeing dragons, creatures your ancestors believed made your family invincible, tear one another apart in the skies. The tragedy of House Targaryen isn't that madness was guaranteed, but that every generation inherited a heavier burden of fear, suspicion, and pressure than the last. Eventually, one king would inherit more pressure than any Targaryen before him. His name was Aerys. Aerys II didn't begin his reign as the Mad King. The early years of his rule gave people hope. He was charismatic, charming, handsome, and spoke of grand projects like building new roads and a second wall. Standing beside him was Tywin Lannister, one of the greatest hands of the king in history. Together, they seemed unstoppable. While Aerys enjoyed the glory, Tywin quietly handled the business of ruling. Taxes improved, the realm prospered, and crime declined. But perfection has a dangerous side. People began praising Tywin more than the king himself. Every victory was credited to Tywin, not Aerys. Sitting on the Iron Throne, wearing the crown, Aerys grew irritated, then suspicious, and finally consumed by jealousy. The friendship between them began to rot. The king stopped trusting his oldest ally, rejected good advice simply because it came from Tywin, and made foolish decisions just to prove he didn't need him. The event that truly shattered Aerys came years later, the defiance of Duskendale. The king traveled to the town expecting obedience, but was instead taken prisoner and locked inside a small room for months, unable to protect himself, wondering every day if he would be killed. Months of isolation reshaped his mind. By the time Ser Barristan Selmy rescued him, the man who left Duskendale was not the same man who had entered. From that day forward, his paranoia became overwhelming. He refused to leave the Red Keep, surrounded himself with flatterers, and stopped cutting his hair or trimming his nails. Every conversation became a potential conspiracy, and every shadow looked like an assassin. Eventually, Aerys found comfort in only one thing: wildfire. It became the answer to every problem. An enemy or rebel? Burn them. His obsession reached its horrifying peak when Lord Rickard Stark came demanding justice for his son. Aerys ordered Rickard chained inside his armor over a blazing fire to cook alive, while his son Brandon helplessly strangled himself on a rope trying to reach him. Cruelty had become entertainment, and the realm knew the Mad King had arrived. Aerys wasn't evil every waking moment. He still had flashes of clarity. That's what real mental collapse looks like, a terrifying mixture of lucidity and delusion. Nobody around him ever knew which version of the king they would meet. Then came Robert's Rebellion. As rebel armies closed in on King's Landing, Aerys reached the final stage of his descent. If he couldn't keep the Iron Throne, no one would. Hidden beneath the streets were enormous caches of wildfire, and his final command was simple: burn them all. He would rather reduce the greatest city in Westeros to ash than allow another king to sit upon his throne. Decades of fear, isolation, humiliation, and obsession had finally reached their inevitable conclusion. Were the Targaryens actually cursed, or have we been looking at their story the wrong way all along? When people say the gods toss a coin, they imagine a literal 50-50 chance of insanity. But history tells us most Targaryens never descended into madness. The dynasty ruled Westeros for almost 3 centuries, with dozens of princes, princesses, kings, and queens. Only a relatively small number became truly unstable. Those are simply the ones everyone remembers, because chaos is unforgettable, while peace is easy to overlook. Nobody makes songs about the king who quietly balanced the treasury. History loves disasters, fire, and blood. So perhaps the Targaryens weren't uniquely cursed, but the conditions that created madness appeared again and again. Every generation inherited impossible expectations. Before you even speak your first words, people expect greatness because your ancestors conquered a continent with dragons. Imagine the psychological weight of being compared to Aegon the Conqueror every single day of your life. Some became obsessed with proving themselves, while others broke beneath the weight of expectation. Then there was prophecy. This family lived by it. Daenerys the Dreamer saved their entire bloodline because of a vision. Centuries later, Prince Rhaegar became convinced another prophecy would determine the fate of the world, and that obsession shaped who he married, who he loved, and the course of an entire kingdom. The Targaryens were prisoners of destiny, always searching for signs from the gods, which often pushed them further from reality. And finally, the dragons. For nearly a century and a half, the Targaryens possessed weapons no one else could challenge. If every disagreement can be solved with dragonfire, compromise starts to look like weakness, and negotiation feels unnecessary. Over generations, that mindset became part of the dynasty itself. Then suddenly, the dragons died. The power disappeared, but the mindset remained. Later kings inherited the pride of dragon lords without the dragons, creating an enormous gap between expectation and reality. Nothing drives people toward desperation faster than trying to reclaim a glorious past that no longer exists. Were they cursed by magic? Maybe. Victims of inbreeding? Possibly. Driven mad by absolute power? For some, almost certainly. But above all, they were broken by grief, war, trauma, isolation, prophecy, and the unbearable weight of believing they were chosen by destiny. Madness rarely has one cause. It's usually 1,000 small cracks until the entire foundation gives way. That's what happened to Maegor, Baelor, Aerys, and arguably Daenerys II. Not because being a Targaryen guaranteed madness, but because it meant carrying burdens that almost no human being was ever meant to bear. The same fire that could save the world could also consume it, because fire has never cared who controls it. They spent centuries believing they had mastered fire, when in the end it was the fire that mastered them. The dynasty didn't fall because madness was inevitable. It fell because generation after generation, they believed they were different, special, and untouchable. But in the end, they were just as human as everyone else. And sometimes, that's the hardest truth of all.